Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Sab-Sunen, Luxa Embodied. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including costs such as shipping. So, Sab-Sunen, Luxa Embodied, is a 6/6 legendary god costing 3 generic, a green, and a blue to cast, with reach, trample, and indestructible. However, Sab-Sunen can't attack or block unless it has an even number of counters on it, with 0 counting as even, and also gets a +1/+1 counter put on it at the beginning of your first main phase, where afterwards you draw 2 cards if it has an odd number of counters on it. Which honestly I thought was a reasonably fun take on a Simic commander, so since what we can do with our commander depends on whether it has an even or odd number of counters on it, I wanted the main theme of this deck to be focused on manipulating the number of counters on our commander in one way or another, such that we get to draw at the start of our first main phase if we're wanting or needing it, but we could also potentially swing the same turn. Much of this will be achieved through spells that simply have us put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, usually paired with another effect, but we can also use proliferate effects, permanents that let us transfer counters between permanents, and counter removal effects to achieve the same end. But that's a very quick overview. Let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up is Wayfarer's Bauble, Font of Fertility, and Sakura Tribe Elder, each permanents that can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. We also have Rampant Growth to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Cultivate and Kodama's Reach to tutor 2 basics that you reveal, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand. Wild Growth enchants a land and makes it so you gain an extra green mana when that land is tapped for mana, while Utopia Sprawl enchants a forest and has you choose a color on ETB, and when that forest is tapped for mana, you also get 1 mana of the chosen color. And finally we have Thought Vessel and Decanter of Endless Water, tapping for generic and any color, respectively, but can also give us no max hand size, which could actually come in handy as our commander can provide a pretty hefty amount of draw, provided we manipulate our counters well throughout the turns. But now let's move on to the majority of spells that we'll be using to manipulate the counter count on Sab-Sunen. First up are Burst of Strength and Stony Strength, 1-drop instants that have you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature and untap it, while Gift of the Viper does the same, while also giving a Death Touch and Reach counter, and as it gives 3 counters, it will still let us manipulate the oddness of the number of counters on our commander. Vastwood Fortification is an instant that just puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature, but as a modal double-faced card, we can use the flip side land Vastwood Thicket in a pinch. Invigorating Surge will ensure Sab-Sunen has an even number of +1/+1 counters on it after it resolves, as it puts a +1/+1 counter on a target creature, and then doubles the number of those counters on that creature. While Merfolk's Diver has you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature when it enters the battlefield, and gives us a way to proliferate off of a permanent, provided we have the mana for it. But moving towards proliferate effects, Pollen Bright Druid has you either proliferate or put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature when it enters the battlefield. Thirsting Roots either lets us proliferate or tutor a basic land which we reveal and put into our hand. Contentious Plan and Steady Progress are cantrips that let us proliferate, while Unnatural Restoration lets us return a target permanent card from our graveyard to our hand, and then we proliferate. Copper Longlegs is a 1/3 with reach that we can sack to proliferate. And then for more consistent proliferation, Flux Channeler has us proliferate whenever we cast a non-creature spell. Thrumming Bird is a 1/1 flyer that has you proliferate whenever it deals combat damage to a player. And Evolution Sage has you proliferate whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Then moving away from Proliferate, Retreat to Kazan-Du and Roaring Earth have you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control when a land enters the battlefield under your control, with the former letting you choose to gain 2 life instead, and the latter also letting you target vehicles, but there aren't any in this deck. Sylvan Scavenging has you choose to either put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, or make a 3/3 Raccoon creature token if you control a creature with a power 4 or greater at the beginning of your end step. Forgotten Ancient gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a player casts a spell, and then at the beginning of your upkeep you can move any number of those +1/+1 counters on Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. Zemek Guildmage lets you remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control to draw a card, or it can make each creature entering the battlefield that turn enter with an additional +1/+1 counter. And Goldberry, River Daughter, can be tapped to move a counter of each kind not on Goldberry from a target creature onto Goldberry, or could be tapped to move 1 or more counters from Goldberry onto another target permanent you control, and then draw a card. Vorel of the Hulkclade can be tapped to double the number of each kind of counter on a target artifact, creature, or land. And finally, Pip-Boy 3000 and Lost Jitte are equipment that have ways to put a +1/+1 counter on its equipped creature, the former letting you choose to do so whenever its equipped creature attacks, or you could draw and then discard a card or untap up to 2 lands. and the latter getting a charge counter whenever its equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, which the trample on our commander should help with. And you can remove a charge counter from Lost Jitte to put a +1/+1 counter on the equipped creature, or you could untap a land, or you can make it so a creature can't block that turn. Now, given that this deck is fairly focused on Sab-Sunen, I've put a couple creatures in here that could act as kind of suboptimal alternative commanders in case our commander's dealt with enough to become too expensive to get back. And these are Mana Gorger Hydra, a 1/1 with trample that gets a +1/+1 counter on it whenever a player casts a spell, and Prime Speaker Zigana, a 1/1 that enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, with X being the greatest power among creatures you control, and you draw cards equal to the number of Prime Speaker Zigana's power when it enters. Now let's move on and talk about our sources of draw, as relying too heavily on our commander for this would definitely be a choice. First up are Combat Research and Sixth Sense, aura enchantments that have you draw when the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, with Combat Research also giving the enchanted creature +1/+1 in Ward 1 if it's legendary. While Bred for the Hunt lets you draw a card whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player. Stocking the Pantry gets a supply counter whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, of which you can pay 2 and remove a supply counter from that enchantment to draw a card. Colossal Majesty has you draw at the beginning of your upkeep if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. Tezzerous Gambit lets you draw 2 cards and then proliferate. And Rishkar's Expertise has you draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and then you can cast a spell with mana value 5 or less from your hand for free. And finally, while not directly draw itself, Teferi's Ageless Insight can really ramp up the amount of draw we get, even just from our commander, as whenever we draw a card, aside from the first card that we draw in our draw steps, we draw 2 cards instead. But now let's move on and talk about the various spells we can use to interact with what our opponents are doing. Starting with some counter spells, we have Counterspell to counter any target spell, then an Offer You Can't Refuse, Negate, and Unwind to counter a target non-creature spell, though the first gives that countered spell's controller 2 treasure tokens, and the last lets you untap up to 3 lands. Spell Rupture counters a target spell unless its controller pays X mana, with X being the greatest power among creatures you control, and Repulsive Mutation counters in the same way, though you get to put X +1/+1 counters, with X being the amount of mana paid into the X cost of that spell, onto a target creature before you counter that target spell. Moving on from counterspells, we have Winterthorn Blessing, putting a +1/+1 counter on up to one of our target creatures, and then you can tap down an opponent's creature, of which that creature doesn't untap on its controller's next untap step. Ancient Animus puts a +1/+1 counter on a target creature if it's legendary, and then that creature fights a target creature an opponent controls. Smell Fear has you proliferate, and then a target creature that you control fights a target creature that you don't control. Felling Blow puts a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control, and then that creature deals damage equal to its power to a target creature an opponent controls. And Ran Through has a target creature deal damage to a creature an opponent controls. But if your creature has trample, such as our commander, excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. Canker Bloom is a creature that we can sack to destroy a target artifact or enchantment, or it can be used to proliferate. Collective Resistance at base has you choose to destroy a target artifact or enchantment, or give a target creature hexproof and indestructible for the turn, but it also has an escalate cost, allowing you to pay 1 extra green mana to access another mode of the spell. Just note that you can't pick the same mode multiple times. Reclamation Sage is a 2/1 that lets you destroy a target artifact or enchantment when it enters the battlefield, and Beast Within lets you destroy a target permanent, though that permanent's controller gets a 3/3 beast creature token in return. Then for a smidge of protection, since we are putting a lot of eggs into one basket for this deck, we have Snakeskin Veil, putting a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control and giving it hexproof for the turn, and Plaxcaster Frogling, entering with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and you can move one from Plaxcaster onto another creature entering the battlefield, and then you can pay 2 mana to give a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it Shroud for the turn. And finally, for interaction en masse, Aetherize bounces all attacking creatures to their owner's hand, useful if somebody overreaches with a wide board, and Azuri's Predation makes a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast creature token for each creature our opponents control, and then each of those tokens fights a different creature, making a wipe for lower toughness creatures and likely leaving us with some 4/4 beasts to use later on. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. First up are some land tutor lands with Shire Terrace and Promising Vein, which we can sack to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Myriad Landscape, which we can sack to tutor 2 basics of the same land type onto the battlefield tapped. Then moving to Simic lands, Yavimaya Coast taps for generic, but could produce green or blue at the cost of pinging ourselves for 1. Flooded Grove also taps for generic, but can convert a blue or a green mana into 2 blue, 2 green, or a blue and a green mana, and Overflowing Basin converts 1 mana into a blue and a green mana. Hinterland Harbor enters untapped if you control at least a forest or an island, and Vine Glimmer Snarl can enter untapped if you reveal a forest or an island card from your hand as it's being played. Temple of Mystery does enter tapped, but it lets you scry 1 as it enters, and Simic Growth Chamber is here as a bounce land. Command Tower can tap for any color mana we could need at the time. And moving to more utility, Mosswort Bridge enters the battlefield tapped, but has Hideaway 4, letting you look at the top 4 cards of your library as the land enters, where you exile one of those 4 cards face down and put the rest onto the bottom of your library in a random order. And then for 1 green mana, you can use Mosswort Bridge to play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if creatures you control have a combined power of 10 or greater. Then Llanowar Reborn enters tapped, but also has a +1/+1 counter on it, of which whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can move that +1/+1 counter from the land onto that creature. Oran Reef, the Vastwood, can be used to put a +1/+1 counter on each green creature that entered the battlefield that turn. And Rogue's Passage can be used to ensure a creature gets through on an opponent. Nesting Grounds can be used to move a counter from a target permanent you control onto another target permanent, though only at sorcery speed. And finally, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 10 basic islands and 11 basic forests. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for about $44.50 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as a list price, this won't account for costs such as shipping. Now before I close out this video, I'd like to go over a handful of cards you may wish to consider if you're wanting to build this deck with a bit higher budget. Karn's Bastion gives you a way to proliferate on a land, while Reliquary Tower gives you no max hand size. Gyre Sage could prove to be a massive mana dork, especially with all the proliferate in this deck, as it has evolved, letting it get a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature with greater power or toughness than it enters the battlefield on your side, and it taps to make a green mana for each +1/+1 counter on Gyre Sage. Inexorable Tide will really ramp up your ability to proliferate, as you do it whenever you cast a spell. While Ripples of Potential has you proliferate, then choose any number of permanents that you control that got a counter put on them from that proliferation, and those permanents phase out, which could be a solid way to avoid interaction or a board wipe without losing our counters. Mutational Advantage gives permanents you control with counters on them hexproof and indestructible, prevents all damage that would be dealt to them that turn, and then has you proliferate. And Silk Guard lets you put a +1/+1 counter on up to X target creatures you control, and then auras, equipment, and modified creatures, so those creatures that are enchanted, equipped, or have counters on them, gain hexproof until the end of the turn. Stubborn Denial is a solid counterspell in this deck, as it normally counters a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1, but you just straight up counter the spell, no questions asked, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. And long-term hexproof combined with Sab-Sunen's inbuilt indestructible could be a potent combo to keep our commander around, and I'd suggest cards like Alpha Authority as an enchantment giving hexproof and making it so the enchanted creature can only be blocked by at most 1 creature, and equipment such as Swiftfoot Boots and Champion's Helm with 1 mana equip costs, the former giving hexproof and haste, and the latter +2/+2, but also hexproof if the equipped creature is legendary. But I should close out this video, so if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider dropping it a like, and maybe sub if you'd like more budget brews in your feeds. Regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.